Some people enter history through power. Others are quietly consumed by it. Joan Kennedy stood at the center of America's most glamorous political dynasty, beautiful, poised, and forever smiling for the cameras. But behind those perfect photographs was a woman carrying heartbreak, betrayal, and unimaginable loss. This is not just the story of a Kennedy wife. It's the story of what happens when a human life is forced to live inside a myth. The girl before the Kennedy name. Before she became a Kennedy, she was simply Joan Bennett. Born in 1936 in the quiet suburb of Bronxville, New York, Joan grew up in a world far removed from the ruthless machinery of American politics. Her father worked in advertising. Her mother believed deeply in appearances, in composure, in presenting a polished version of life, no matter what was happening beneath the surface. It was a lesson Joan would spend the rest of her life trying and failing to survive. She was beautiful, effortlessly so. Tall, blonde, graceful. The kind of young woman who seemed destined to glide through life untouched by hardship. But beneath that elegance was something far more delicate. Joan felt things deeply. Music was her refuge. The piano became the language she spoke when words failed her. Long before the headlines, before the cameras, before the Kennedy name attached itself to her identity, there was simply a young woman who dreamed of a life shaped by art, family, and love. Then came October 1957, a college event, an introduction through mutual friends, a handsome young man with a famous last name and a future that seemed limitless. Ted Kennedy. At first glance, he appeared to be everything America would later come to adore about the Kennedy family. Charismatic, confident, magnetic. He entered rooms as if he already belonged at the center of history. People gravitated toward him instinctively. Joan was no exception. For a 21-year-old woman raised on ideals of romance and devotion, Ted must have seemed impossible to resist. And perhaps that is the cruelest thing about stories like this. The beginning rarely looks dangerous. It looks exciting. It looks glamorous. It looks like destiny. Friends saw a fairy tale unfolding. Her parents were thrilled. The Kennedys represented wealth, influence, prestige, and a future brighter than anything most families could imagine. To the outside world, Joan Bennett had won life's greatest prize. On November 29, 1958, she walked down the aisle wearing a radiant white gown as flashbulbs exploded around her. The photographs captured en fait a beautiful bride, a rising Kennedy, a future filled with promise. But photographs have a way of lying. Because while Joan was stepping into marriage, she was also stepping into something much larger than she could possibly understand. A dynasty built on ambition, a family protected by power, a world where image mattered more than truth and where loyalty often demanded silence. Years later, many would look at Joan Kennedy and see only the woman she became, the woman who struggled, the woman who unraveled, the woman who seemed unable to survive the weight of the Kennedy name. But almost nobody stopped to ask a more unsettling question. What if Joan Kennedy wasn't broken by her own weaknesses? What if she was slowly broken by the world she married into, and that world was about to reveal itself? Camelot from the inside. And that world was about to reveal itself. From the outside, the Kennedy family looked like American royalty. They were young, wealthy, beautiful, and seemingly destined to shape the future of the nation. Newspapers celebrated them. Photographers chased them. Millions admired them. But every dynasty has two versions of itself. The one the public sees, and the one hidden behind closed doors. By the time Joan married Ted Kennedy, the family was no longer simply a family. It had become a machine, an institution fueled by ambition, discipline, and an almost obsessive commitment to preserving the Kennedy image. At the center of that machine stood Joseph Kennedy Sr., the powerful patriarch who had spent decades building a political empire. Success was expected. Strength was demanded. Weakness, if it existed at all, was never discussed, especially not by the women. For Kennedy wives, there was an unspoken job description. Be beautiful, be supportive, smile when the cameras appear, protect the family at all costs, and above all, never become the story. Joan tried. God knows she tried. She threw herself into motherhood, welcoming 3 children into the world over the next several years. To friends and family, she appeared devoted, attentive, and loving. She adored her children. In many ways, being a mother became the most authentic role she would ever play. But beneath the carefully staged photographs, cracks were already beginning to form. Because while Joan was learning how to become a Kennedy wife, she was also learning something else about the man she had married. Something painful, something lonely. Ted Kennedy was rarely faithful. The rumors arrived first. Whispers at social gatherings. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Glances exchanged between people who knew more than they wanted to say. Then came the certainty, the affairs, the betrayals, the humiliating realization that many people around her had known long before she did. And perhaps most devastating of all was the response she received when she struggled with it. Not outrage, not sympathy, acceptance. Within the world Joan had married into, a Kennedy man's indiscretions were often treated as unfortunate but expected. The system had learned how to absorb them. The wives were expected to do the same. But Joan was different. She wasn't built to compartmentalize pain. She wasn't built to pretend betrayal didn't hurt. She felt everything. And that sensitivity, the very thing that made her warm, compassionate, and deeply human, would slowly become a liability inside a family that rewarded emotional endurance above emotional honesty. As the 1960s unfolded, America was falling in love with Camelot. But inside Camelot, Joan Kennedy was beginning to discover something unsettling. The closer you stood to greatness, the harder it became to distinguish admiration from sacrifice. And before long, tragedy would arrive at the Kennedy doorstep again and again, testing not only the family itself, but the woman quietly disappearing inside it. The years of grief. And before long, tragedy would arrive at the Kennedy doorstep again and again, testing not only the family itself, but the woman quietly disappearing inside it. For America, the 1960s were a decade of hope change and unimaginable heartbreak. For Joan Kennedy, they became a decade of survival. In January 1961, she stood among the crowds watching her brother-in-law, John F. Kennedy, take the oath of office as President of the United States. The nation saw glamour, youth, possibility, the birth of what many would later call Camelot. It looked like history at its brightest. But history has a habit of collecting its debts. Less than 3 years later, gunfire echoed through Dallas. President Kennedy was dead. America watched the funeral on television. Millions cried from their living rooms. But Joan wasn't watching from a distance. She was inside the tragedy itself, standing beside a grieving family forced to mourn under the gaze of an entire nation. At just 27 years old, she learned a lesson that would define much of her life. In the Kennedy world, grief was public, but pain was private. There was no time to fall apart, no room to ask difficult questions, no permission to admit fear, and fear was becoming impossible to ignore. In 1964, Ted narrowly survived a devastating plane crash that killed 2 men. For months, he remained hospitalized with severe injuries. Once again, Joan stepped forward, attending events and helping preserve the public image of strength and stability. Then came another blow. In June 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated moments after winning the California Democratic primary. Another brother, another funeral, another shattered dream. By then, death no longer felt like an interruption in the Kennedy story. It felt like part of the story itself. And while the world focused on the fallen men, few noticed the emotional toll being carried by the women left standing beside the coffins. Joan carried it all: the fear, the uncertainty, the endless expectation to remain composed. At the same time, she was enduring heartbreaks of her own. Multiple pregnancies ended in miscarriage losses. She grieved largely in silence. There were no headlines for those moments, no national mourning, no public sympathy. Only empty rooms, private tears, and another appearance scheduled for tomorrow. Somewhere during those years, alcohol began to offer what the people around her could not: relief. A temporary escape from sorrow, a brief silence from the noise. At first it was almost invisible: a drink before an event, a glass of wine after another difficult day. But pain that goes unspoken rarely disappears. It simply finds another voice. And as the decade drew to a close, Joan Kennedy was carrying more grief than anyone could see. What nobody realized was that an even greater storm was approaching. One summer night in 1969 would change everything, not just for Ted Kennedy, but for Joan, their marriage, and the rest of her life. Its name was Chappaquiddick. Chappaquiddick, the night. Everything changed. Its name was Chappaquiddick. More than half a century later, that single word still hangs over the Kennedy legacy, like a shadow that never completely disappeared. On the night of July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy attended a gathering on Chappaquiddick Island, a small stretch of land off Martha's Vineyard. It was supposed to be an ordinary summer evening among friends and former campaign staffers. It ended with a young woman dead. Her name was Mary Jo Kopechne. Sometime before midnight, Ted Kennedy left the party with Mary Jo in his car. Minutes later, the vehicle plunged off a narrow wooden bridge into dark water below. Ted escaped. Mary Jo did not. What happened in the hours that followed would become one of the most controversial chapters in American political history. Questions multiplied. Timelines shifted. Explanations failed to satisfy. The accident itself was tragic enough, but it was the silence afterward that haunted people. For Joan Kennedy, however, the story was unfolding from an entirely different perspective. She wasn't on the island that night. She wasn't at the party. She was at home pregnant once again after enduring previous miscarriages, confined to bed, and trying to protect a fragile pregnancy. Then the phone rang, and suddenly the life she had spent years struggling to hold together began slipping through her fingers. The headlines exploded. The cameras arrived. The Kennedy machine mobilized. And once again, Joan was asked to do what had become her most familiar role: stand beside him, smile if possible, endure if necessary. The public saw a loyal wife supporting her husband through scandal. But behind closed doors, the emotional cost was immeasurable. A young woman was dead. Questions surrounded her husband's actions. The nation was watching, and Joan was expected to absorb all of it in silence. Shortly afterward, she suffered another miscarriage. Whether caused by stress, grief, or circumstances, no one could fully explain the loss, became yet another wound added to a growing collection of wounds nobody seemed willing to acknowledge. Something inside her changed after Chappaquiddick. Not overnight, not dramatically, but permanently. Because there are moments in life when reality becomes impossible to avoid. Moments when the story you've been telling yourself can no longer survive the truth standing in front of you. For Joan Kennedy, Chappaquiddick was that moment. The illusion was cracking. The marriage was weakening. And the pain she had spent years trying to contain was becoming impossible to hide. The world would continue to see a Kennedy wife. But beneath the pearls, the photographs, and the carefully rehearsed smiles, a quiet collapse had already begun. The public unraveling. The world would continue to see a Kennedy wife. But beneath the pearls, the photographs, and the carefully rehearsed smiles, a quiet collapse had already begun. The years after Chappaquiddick were not marked by a single dramatic breakdown. They were marked by something far more devastating, a slow erosion of spirit. From the outside, Ted Kennedy's career survived. In many ways, it flourished. He remained one of the most influential figures in American politics, admired by supporters and protected by the enduring power of the Kennedy name. Joan, meanwhile, was fighting battles no campaign could solve. The drinking that had begun as a way to numb grief was becoming harder to control. There were attempts at treatment, periods of recovery, moments when it seemed she might finally find stable ground beneath her feet. But every recovery required confronting the pain that had driven her there in the first place. And there was so much pain. Years of betrayal. Years of public performance. Years spent living inside a role that no longer resembled who she truly was. Then came 1979. Ted Kennedy announced his challenge against President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination. It was the moment many had expected for years, the youngest Kennedy brother finally reaching for the White House. And somehow, despite everything that had happened, Joan agreed to help. Perhaps it was loyalty. Perhaps it was hope. Or perhaps it was the lingering belief that if this campaign succeeded, something broken between them might finally be repaired. Instead, the campaign exposed every fracture. For the first time, Joan wasn't simply standing in the background. She was visible, speaking, traveling, facing reporters directly. And the scrutiny was relentless. Every expression became a headline. Every appearance became a test. Every sign of exhaustion became a story. The public wasn't looking at Joan Kennedy as a person. They were watching her as a symbol of the Kennedy marriage, a symbol of the family's troubles, a symbol of a dynasty beginning to show its cracks. The pressure became unbearable. And as the campaign stumbled, so did the illusion that the marriage could survive. By the time Ted's presidential dream collapsed in 1980, another dream had already died. The dream Joan Bennett had carried since that wedding day in 1958. The fairy tale was over. The cameras would soon capture the official ending. But in truth, Joan Kennedy's marriage had been ending for years. And for the first time in her adult life, she was about to discover who she was without the Kennedy name. Life after Camelot. And for the first time in her adult life, she was about to discover who she was without the Kennedy name. When the divorce became final in 1982, Joan Kennedy was 45 years old. That may not sound extraordinary, but consider this: she had spent nearly her entire adult life inside systems built by other people. First her parents, then the Kennedys. For more than 2 decades, her identity had been intertwined with one of the most powerful families in America. Now suddenly, she was alone. No campaign schedules, no political dinners, no carefully choreographed family photographs. Just silence. And sometimes, silence can be more frightening than chaos. At first, Joan tried to rebuild. She returned to something that had once made her feel whole long before the world knew her name: music. She enrolled in graduate school studying music education and eventually earning a master's degree. It was a quiet achievement, one that received little media attention, but revealed something important about her character. Despite everything she had lost, she was still searching for herself, still trying, still moving forward. But recovery is rarely a straight line. The alcohol dependency that had followed her for years remained a constant shadow. There were periods of sobriety and optimism, followed by painful relapses that once again drew public attention. And that attention could be merciless. The press rarely wrote about Joan the musician, or Joan the student, or Joan the mother. Instead, they returned to the same narrative over and over again. The troubled ex-wife, the fallen Kennedy, the woman who couldn't survive Camelot. Yet that version of Joan was only part of the story, because beneath the headlines was a woman fighting every day to reclaim a life that had belonged to everyone except herself. She wrote a book celebrating classical music. She spoke openly about addiction. She tried to help others understand the struggles she knew so intimately. There was courage in that. Not the dramatic courage celebrated in political speeches, but the quieter kind. The courage to keep rebuilding after the world has already decided who you are. And as the years passed, another truth became impossible to ignore. Perhaps Joan Kennedy's greatest challenge had never been surviving the Kennedys. Perhaps it was learning how to survive herself after they were gone. What was taken from her? Perhaps Joan Kennedy's greatest challenge had never been surviving the Kennedys. Perhaps it was learning how to survive herself after they were gone. Because the deeper you look at her story, the harder it becomes to see it as simply a tale of addiction scandal or personal failure. Those were the symptoms, not the cause. For decades, the public was taught to view Joan Kennedy through a narrow lens. The troubled wife, the alcoholic, the woman who couldn't handle the pressure. But pressure alone doesn't destroy a person. What destroys people is carrying pain that has nowhere to go. And Joan carried an extraordinary amount of it. Years of public humiliation hidden behind polite smiles. Years of miscarriages mourned in silence. Years of watching her husband's infidelities become an open secret while being expected to pretend nothing was wrong. Years of standing beside tragedy after tragedy while receiving little space to process her own grief. The remarkable thing is not that she struggled. The remarkable thing is that anyone expected her not to. Because beneath every headline was a woman trying desperately to remain human inside a system that rewarded performance more than honesty. The Kennedy women were celebrated for their grace, but grace often came with a hidden cost. They were expected to absorb pain quietly, to protect the image, to preserve the myth, to carry burdens without revealing their weight. Joan was never particularly good at that, and perhaps that's why her suffering became so visible. She felt deeply. She loved deeply. She hurt deeply. The very qualities that made her vulnerable were also the qualities that made her real. People who knew her often described a different Joan than the one portrayed in newspapers. They spoke of warmth, humor, intelligence, kindness. A woman who could spend hours talking about music, family, and life. A woman who never fully lost the gentle spirit she carried long before she became a Kennedy. Yet history rarely rewards complexity. It prefers simpler stories. Heroes, villains, successes, failures. Joan fit none of those categories. She existed somewhere in between. And maybe that's why she was so often misunderstood. Because the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that Joan Kennedy wasn't merely struggling against addiction. She was struggling against decades of accumulated sorrow, against expectations she never created, against a role she never fully chose, and against a version of herself that the world insisted on remembering. But even after the marriage ended, even after the headlines faded, even after the Kennedy spotlight moved elsewhere, Joan kept showing up. And in that persistence there was a kind of strength far greater than the world ever gave her credit for. A strength that would be tested one final time as loss continued to follow her into the later chapters of her life. The final losses. A strength that would be tested one final time as loss continued to follow her into the later chapters of her life. By the 2000s, the spotlight that had once followed Joan Kennedy everywhere had grown dimmer. The cameras appeared less often. The headlines became smaller. The public had largely moved on, but grief had not. Some losses arrive suddenly. Others linger for decades. Joan had already spent much of her life saying goodbye to dreams, to marriages, to versions of herself that no longer existed. Yet the hardest farewells were still ahead. In August 2009, Ted Kennedy died after a battle with brain cancer. For many Americans, it marked the end of a political era. The last great Kennedy brother was gone. Newspapers reflected on his achievements, his controversies, and the legacy he would leave behind. For Joan, the moment carried a different weight. Their marriage had ended years earlier, but history is rarely that simple. You do not spend 20 years building a life with someone and emerge untouched by their absence. She attended his memorial services, quietly, dignified as always, standing once again among the family that had shaped so much of her life for better and for worse. But an even deeper heartbreak was waiting just around the corner. In 2011, her daughter Cara Kennedy died suddenly of a heart attack at only 51 years old. No parent is prepared for that loss. Not at 30, not at 60, not ever. Friends who knew Joan described the devastation as profound. Cara had been more than a daughter. She was a source of joy, connection, and continuity. Losing her felt like losing a piece of herself. And yet, as she had done so many times before, Joan carried the grief quietly. There were no dramatic interviews, no public displays, only the private endurance of a mother forced to confront the unimaginable. As the years passed, her world became smaller. Boston remained home. Music remained a comfort. Family remained her anchor. The woman once photographed at glamorous political galas now spent her days far from the centers of power that had once defined her existence. And perhaps there was something poetic about that. Because the further she moved from the Kennedy myth, the closer she seemed to the person she had always been underneath it. Not a symbol, not a scandal, not a political spouse. Just Joan, a woman who had survived far more than most people ever knew. When Joan Kennedy passed away in October 2025 at the age of 89, many obituaries focused on the familiar headlines, the marriage, the addiction, the famous family. But those headlines never fully captured the truth. The truth was far more complicated. And to understand why her story still matters today, we have to look beyond the tragedy and ask a much deeper question. Did history ever truly see Joan Kennedy for who she was? The woman history forgot. Did history ever truly see Joan Kennedy for who she was? Or did it only see the role she was forced to play that may be the most important question that her story leaves behind? Because Joan Kennedy was never invisible. She appeared in countless photographs. She attended historic events. Her face became intertwined with one of the most famous political families in American history. And yet somehow the real Joan remained unseen. History remembered the image, the beautiful blonde standing beside a Kennedy, the loyal wife, the troubled alcoholic, the woman who seemed to fall apart. Those fragments became her public identity. But a human life is never the same thing as its headlines. The deeper tragedy of Joan Kennedy's story isn't that she suffered, it's that so few people ever stopped to ask why. Why did a gifted young woman who loved music spend decades struggling to find peace? Why did a wife expected to absorb betrayal become the one remembered for her wounds rather than the wounds that caused them? Why did a culture so fascinated by the Kennedy myth have so little curiosity about the emotional cost of sustaining it? Perhaps because myths require sacrifices. Every dynasty has its celebrated figures, the presidents, the senators, the visionaries whose names fill history books. But every dynasty also leaves people standing in the shadows, people whose lives become secondary to the larger story being told. Joan was one of those people, not because she lacked strength, but because her strength took a form history rarely rewards. She survived, again and again. She survived public humiliation. She survived addiction. She survived heartbreak. She survived the collapse of her marriage. She survived the loss of dreams of certainty of the future she once imagined for herself. And somehow, through all of it, she kept moving forward. There is something profoundly human in that, because most lives are not defined by triumph. They are defined by endurance, by the decision to wake up after disappointment, to keep loving after loss, to keep searching for meaning after the story you believed in has fallen apart. In many ways, Joan Kennedy's life was not a tragedy. The tragedy was that the world often reduced her to one. When she died in 2025, she left behind more than a connection to the Kennedy name. She left behind a quieter legacy. A reminder that behind every famous family, every glamorous photograph, every carefully constructed public image, there are human beings carrying private battles no camera can capture. And perhaps that is the truth hidden inside Joan Kennedy's story. She was never merely the woman standing beside history. She was a person fighting to preserve herself while history unfolded around her. And maybe after all these years, the most meaningful thing we can do is finally see her not as a footnote in the Kennedy saga, but as the author of a remarkable, complicated, and deeply human story of her own.